So thanks for everyone for joining. I appreciate it. It's the 10 a.m. hour in California, which means that, like me, you're probably skipping Sweat Fest with Ryan Heffington on Instagram. So I appreciate everyone showing up. Today we'll be talking about hiring your first product marketing manager and how to do so during these unusual and uncertain times with less resources and less face time. Like Ted said, my name is Ryan Goldman. Here's a little bit of my journey as a marketer and as a product marketer. Haven't always been. You can see the relationship directly between jobs and responsibility and the presence of gray hairs on my head. So the most interesting ones are towards the end here. So early in my career, I did a lot of international development work for nonprofit organizations, and that actually is something to think about in terms of when you're hiring a marketing organization. You know, can they be focused on beneficiaries? Can they be focused on the mission of your organization and not just the metrics and the programs? So I spent some time at very heavily technical and developer focused and operations engineering focused organizations like Cloudera, Signal FX, Sentry. Most recently, as Ted said, I have been running product marketing at Pendo. I also have some experience as an advisor, both in product marketing and marketing in general, to other developer-oriented companies like Apollo GraphQL, like Kong, like Algolia. All of those things come together to influence the way I think about product marketing. And as I go through this presentation, keep in mind that there is not one best way to do things. This is meant to be kind of a construct for thinking about your problems and thinking about your opportunities. But the best advice I can give to you about hiring a product marketer is make sure they understand your market and your business and your customer. That changes with every organization. They bring things with them from each experience, but they have to be focused on driving outcomes and driving strategy for your community, and that's essential. So we hear a lot about, especially SaaS tools, especially developer-oriented tools, about being product-led. That if you've built the right product, if it delivers value, then the entire experience can be within the product. And we have data here from OpenView partners that says, like, hey, SaaS organizations do well. Especially public SaaS organizations. Product-led organizations do even better. They deliver more enterprise value. Their revenue tends to be faster and bigger. We have all kinds of insight from organizations like Atlassian and Zoom that say, like, hey, if you build a thing and you make it valuable enough and easy enough to use, and the entire journey, the entire experience, both in terms of conversion as well as retention, as well as all the things that would happen from sales and marketing are within the product itself, hey, people will love it and they'll pay you. And they'll pay you more and more every year just because the product is there. What this doesn't really take into consideration is that, yeah, that's great. And that means you can plow a lot of additional money into your R&D. We see that product-led organizations tend to spend way, way more, a multiple on R&D as a percentage of total revenue compared to other organizations, especially SaaS. But that has challenges too. It carries a little bit of weight and overhead because it means that, hey, unfettered, without thinking about the market, without thinking about the customer, only thinking about what you can build, you stop thinking necessarily about what you should build. And more importantly, for whom? And how do you actually get it into their hands? And how do you make sure that it's valuable? These are a lot of questions that you probably should ask before you go out and build the next thing or the next feature. And that tends to be part of the responsibility of product marketing. So this isn't to say that product-led is the wrong way to go. Product-led has space for product marketing. It's that group's responsibility or that person's responsibility to think through, can we generate ROI from this? And if we're going to generate ROI from this, how and with whom? Where's their value? Why should they care? So this little graphic at the bottom basically talks about, in a world that is basically only driven by this idea of better processes and relationships and collaboration, your product-led product organization ends up turning into a cost center without thinking about the market. You have to think about how your product is going to drive profits. So is there evidence to support this? Well, yeah. So some of this evidence comes from Pendo, some of it comes from Gartner, but we have found that getting people to actually use your product especially secondary, tertiary products and new features, is really hard. When we say that between 10 and 60% of new features get adopted, it tends towards the lower end of that. Pendo's data has shown that 80% of new features, especially for SaaS, don't get used. And we say hardly used, like by fewer than 5% of your total usership, which means that ultimately $30 billion in R&D gets wasted. It's not to say that those development projects and those features and products were bad. It probably just means that they weren't targeted. They weren't delivered in the right way to the user base. There wasn't a go-to-market that was focused on like what is the product positioning, messaging, and objectives that will actually drive adoption and ultimately return on investment. Those are the responsibilities of product marketing. So when we talk about intimacy, when we talk about what is marketing for, typically we see this kind of construct. We see first, okay, what is the product? We're building it, we've built it. What are the features that determine it? How do we define it? Then we say, okay, how do you implement it? Can we give some really, really good guidance either through our blog or through our documentation or through webinars that say like, okay, how do you get it into production? And last, we sometimes say like, okay, why did we build it? Like what's really cool about this? Like what convinced us that this would be like a super duper rad and important and cool feature or product to add? But that's very, very inside out. It looks at sort of the culture and the beliefs and sometimes the religion of your organization and fails to think about like, okay, are we gonna sell this and to whom? Does it matter if people adopt it and then stop using it, if it's not sticky? Whose fault is that? Well, you have to think about why people even need the next thing that comes from your product organization. And that's a responsibility of product marketing. So a more modern way of looking at intimacy is from the market perspective and not simply from the product perspective. We know that in different organizations, the product marketing organization can sit under the product organization or can sit under the marketing organization. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. They need to be close to both. But the thing that they need to think about, the thing they need to lead with is the mission, the objective of not getting the product just onto the shelf, building it and delivering. That's your product organization's job. It's getting it off the shelf and into the hands of your users with some perspective potentially on how to evaluate value. So the first thing they should be asking is, for whom is this? Who is going to actually resolve some pain as a result of this new product or feature? The second thing is, okay, why does it have any value? Like against what kind of criteria will they even be evaluating it? Sure, it can solve a pain, but to what extent does it even solve the pain and will they continue to use it to get that outcome? And I have this next part circled because it's usually where the product marketing organization starts to fall apart. A good product marketer can figure out the segment that it's targeted at and also like the value proposition story of why, but how is really tough. You have to be at least a little bit oriented towards the product because you have to be able to say, okay, like what does this actually, where does this actually fit? It's not going to change things overnight. Hopefully it will rationalize the way that your organization, your customer's organization does their work. It will fit into some kind of workflow. Okay, how does it fit into the workflow? Where does the data come from? Where does the data go? Where is the integration? How does this change the way your team does its work from day to day? And then lastly, you talk about what. Remember, on the old way, we're starting with what is the product. Now we're saying, okay, you end up with what? Because you say, okay, if you're able to establish who the audience is or who the user is, why should they even care? How is this going to fit? Then the last thing you say is, okay, here is the story about the product. Here are the features that fit into that framework. Here's how you're going to actually start doing the thing in order to get back up to the value proposition. So what does a product marketer do? This is a pretty big framework that is quite popular, that has been shared by the Pragmatic Institute. It's their framework for product marketing. And there is no doubt that all of this is true. They have on the left side of the framework strategy and on the right side execution. I agree with this for all intents and purposes, because like we saw on that last slide, that last inverted triangle, you start with the market, you start with the who, you start with the why, and you eventually get into the business of the, like, what is the product and how does it work? And then eventually you say, like, okay, how do you take those insights and then put them into projects that go beyond just product marketing? How do you influence field marketing? How do you influence sales enablement and alignment? How do you go into customer success? Absolutely true. But this is, for an early stage company, especially hiring their first product marketer, this is a lot. It's not boiled down enough. It's taking on too much responsibility at once. You'll also never find someone who's like, as an individual contributor, to do all of these things. So I tend to think of these things in two categories. One is go-to-market strategy. The other one is solution strategy. For the most part, early on, you're going to be thinking about your go-to-market because you're building fast. You've got a clear sense of the product market fit you want to build, and you're just trying to push that forward. However, product marketing's responsibility is also on the solution side. So thinking about, as you come up with new features to define your platform, how do you kind of thread the needle of talking about the use case and the value proposition? How do you think through the architecture of the products and the tools the customer already has in its stack, and pulling those things together? What is the experience of the buyer and the user from end to end and over the lifetime relationship with your company? So being able to find people who are thinking not only about, like, how do you launch a product, but then also how do you articulate a solution so that you can drive all the metrics that you care about: higher prices, lifetime value, quicker time to value for the customer. These are all key things. And so the reason for this isn't to say, hey, we're going to just replace the pragmatic framework. To say, here's a simpler, more boiled down version of the pragmatic framework. You still have to figure out what's important from these 12 things. Start to sketch together, like, where you believe your priorities are in terms of product marketing, go to market, so that when you're looking for your first hire, or after you've hired your first product marketer and you're trying to enable them and make sure that they're aligned to the values and the objectives of the executive team, that you're on the same page. And let him or her also contribute to the strategy. They'll have some feelings about, like, which of these 12 things are probably most important, where are the priorities, and they'll be able to help define that as well. So how do you measure these things? How do you know if it's working at all? The biggest, so I've been doing product marketing for over a decade now, and the biggest question I always hear, even during interviews for an executive role, is what are the KPIs? What are the metrics? Like, how are you going to measure yourself? And so in the mind of most founders and most CEOs and COOs, the marketing KPI framework looks like this. It's a funnel, right? You get your traffic, and then you turn that into some kind of marketing qualified lead, and then you convert into an opportunity through the sales organization, and eventually you have a customer. And then there's the things beyond this in terms of retention and expansion and loyalty. Yeah, this is a very, very good framework for 2010, because the fact of the matter is, going back to those original ideas about being product led, if you have the right product, if you figured out who your audience is, this is a framework for how you go to market via channels, which require budget and a media strategy, but they have very little to do ultimately with an understanding of your market and the use case and the value proposition, and how you're going to grow the business based on both delivering value and bringing back value as profits. So I say, okay, this is not a new thing. Ryan didn't invent this, but there's a flywheel here, right? And you should be thinking about the lifetime value of the relationship with your customer. And you should be thinking about how product marketing doesn't only contribute to that last framework of, like, getting leads and delivering leads and converting leads, but also how do you enable the customer success organization? How do you allow product marketing to actually have a direct contribution to the happiness and value experience by your customers, so that they can actually drive pipeline and they can drive expansion? There'll never be metrics that product marketing wholly owns. You can kind of come up with them. I like to say, like, the most important ones tend to be quarter over quarter pipeline growth, as well as improvement in conversion from MQL to SQL to opportunity. But still, those are not owned by product marketing. Product marketing's entire measurement should be on how well it multiplies other people's work. how it takes out friction, how it unblocks people, how it makes sure that the best insights are delivered from the end of the journey back to the beginning of the journey, so that the go-to-market organization, sorry, the demand generation organization, the digital organization, the people who are spending the budget are spending it in the right way, so that you can continually improve on the metrics they're being measured against. I like to say that product marketing is the axis around which all of go-to-market spins. And I tend to think that that's true. In the absence of that axis, sure, you can do these things. You can spend money really, really well. But in the presence of that axis, you tend to get a little bit closer to integration and having a complete playbook from which everybody's executing. So that's the entire purpose for this idea of the modern go-to-market objectives for product marketing. So getting back to this point about multiplying, these are the things about which not only you, but your first product marketing person should be thinking. They need to think about the objectives in terms of enabling campaigns and plays and taking a value-based approach. But they should also be, and you should also be thinking about, is your objective sales efficiency, sales effectiveness, or the combination of the two? Even if you're product-led, even if you don't have a proper sales organization and it's all converted through the product itself, there still has to be some concept of like, how much does it cost to get there? And how much are the customers expanding over time? If you're not thinking about things like lifetime value and NRR, you should be, even during the early stages, because those first few customers, if they don't become your best customers in a short form, then your product isn't doing what it needs to, or your go-to-market and enablement isn't doing what they need to. So there are metrics, they're just not ones that are wholly owned by product marketing, but product marketing needs to be thinking about all of these things. And there should be actually a third column here, which is product metrics. Just like the sales organization or the product organization thinking about revenue thinks about some of these key metrics. The product organization building or helping to build the product is also thinking about adoption, stickiness, conversion, retention. Those are all things that product marketing can help to drive. And the fact of the matter is, we see, especially for product-led organizations, once you get to the period after which product marketing has been running the campaign to launch a new feature, a lot of those things like retention really fall off. So there has to be an earlier engagement with product marketing to actually rationalize, are we building the right things for the right people for the right reasons? Because marketing can't take all the responsibility for maintaining engagement. Product can build the best thing it thinks or help to drive the best thing that it thinks, but if ultimately it's not aligned to permanent value, then something has gone wrong. So who are the types of people that you might engage, you might encounter? We heard from a couple of the people before the webinar started that they're looking at like 10s and 20s and even hundreds of candidates for different roles. You can probably split them into four categories, especially if you're an early stage company, especially if you're looking to raise your A or your seed rounds. If they've heard about you, if you're going through the right channels to find candidates, they're probably people with some kind of affinity towards one of these groups. So we have the Silicon Valley refugee. This is the type of person who has worked as a product marketer at a larger organization. Probably a technology organization that's gone public, and they've been there for a little while, and they've come to the realization that they don't have as much influence. Like their contributions to the strategy, their contributions to the path going forward has gotten smaller and smaller over time, and they're trying to get back to like that spark, that ability to actually drive outcomes for an organization that actually cares about just getting to product market fit. So this is the type of person you'll see a lot of the time if you've kind of generated a lot of buzz around your company. The nice thing about them is that they tend to be focused on the market. You know, a lot of the things that I've talked about in terms of values, they're there already, they've seen it. But that might also be a little bit heavyweight for an early stage organization who's just thinking about how to build these things in the first place, how to execute cleanly and without any kind of mistakes. Because a Silicon Valley refugee has seen the structure. They've seen how things can be done at an elite organization, and it may be hard for them to return to those early days. The second type of persona would be the stud athlete. And you'll notice the persona that I use here is wearing a Salesforce Trailblazer sweatshirt. So this is the type of person who hasn't been a product marketing manager before, but they've excelled in another role, whether it's marketing operations or even sales enablement or sales operations or demand generation, because they've just done a lot and they've been really good at it. And they've kind of figured out that like, hey, I actually believe that I can do well as a strategist beyond just the metrics, thinking about the market and the product. I'm actually a little bit technical at this point, having worked with technical teams. I'm thinking about how to get earlier in terms of how I influence the strategy. So that they really want the strategic focus that is not simply based on channels, metrics, budgets. They're thinking about market, product, and user. The thing that goes well for these people is they tend to get on super well with their stakeholders. They just have that personality, that stick to it, driving athletic characteristic that makes their affinity score really, really high. And they tend to be like a really strong ambassador for the marketing organization out to the rest of the company. So they tend to be very, very company focused. The challenge there, though, is that this person doesn't understand like the nuance of product marketing. They don't necessarily understand all of the market dynamics or competition or differentiation. They tend to get really, really into working with their first line stakeholder of like the sales team, if you have a sales team, and don't necessarily know how to build the program from the bottom up. The heat seeker is the next person. So this is someone who has done product marketing at another startup, and they've done it pretty well, but maybe that company is kind of fallen on hard times. They're no longer the cool kid on the block, and they're looking for their next move where they can kind of attach their cart to the next rocket ship. These people have never seen structure in a lot of cases, so they know how to execute. They understand the market. They're very thoughtful and smart, but they've probably been the first or second product marketing hire, the first or second marketing hire at a couple of companies now. And so they haven't necessarily, they're kind of like the complete opposite of the Silicon Valley refugee. They've never seen how to like scale up. They've never had a manager who has kind of put the process in place for them to make sure they're multiplying and having that like broad impact. But they can speak the language of execution. They know how to get things done, and they know how to do the right things really, really, really well. So these people tend to be career focused. They're looking for the way that they can advance in their careers, build an argument for managing a team, and move up to the next level of title. And then the last is the utility star. This is the type of person, they may have been a product marketer in the past, but it almost doesn't matter because they've done so many things. What they're looking for is a way to use product marketing to get involved in demand generation and even get involved in sales. You'll meet a lot of early stage company product marketers who are actually pitching, not just talking to customers and listening on sales pitches to understand things, but they're actually getting involved in the pitch. They're prone towards leadership. They have that hunger to actually influence and get in the conversation with everybody they can because they're always looking to learn as well as have some kind of influence over what the strategy is. And they tend to be very, very outcomes oriented. They won't talk about a project until it's close to execution because they want to be certain that like a lot of the dependencies have been clearly stated and they're able to say like, okay, I may not own the metric, but I have a pretty clear understanding of and want to talk about the thing that I'm going to hopefully deliver for the company that we can all measure against. This person is, you know, in my opinion, as we describe like the T-shaped marketer, the full stack product marketer. They start in one place and they move into the next. They can take on a lot. They have a lot of headspace. The challenge with them though is sometimes the early stage organization doesn't have a need for a big splashy demand generation campaign that's driven from a clear understanding of the market. And so they may get frustrated by only having a few things to do at first. Even though they own them, it just may not be enough. So they tend to be really, really thorough, broad and deep, but sometimes they're a little bit too much. So once you get into the hiring process, what are some of the ways that you can make sure that you're getting the right person for you? What are some of the ways to kind of figure out, like, regardless of which of those four personas you're talking to, are they the right fit for your organization? Can they do product marketing at the kind of scale that you hope? Because you're not hiring for today only, you're hiring for hopefully the next couple of years of your organization's growth. So I always, as a hiring manager, use case questions. I use case questions for every role. So in my current role, I'm interviewing for office managers, I'm interviewing for sales operations people, I'm interviewing for internal culture people. I always use a case question. The reason is I want to see how they interact with the problem. Do they treat it like play? Do they get excited by getting things wrong, such that they say, oh, okay, I had the wrong hypothesis, or I had the wrong idea, or I jumped to the end too fast, but I really, really do want to engage the person that I'm talking to and try and like be a truffle pig for the right information. So like those people who can get, like really get excited about solving a problem tend to do really well in product marketing roles. Introduce a real project. So if you have some ideas about the types of things that you want the product marketer or any kind of marketer to execute, lead with that. During the interview process, say, okay, here's a thing that we're thinking about. We're thinking about launching this product. We're thinking about running this kind of campaign for this kind of audience. We're thinking about partnering with this kind of organization. Tell me what you would do. Like put together the rough plan. Get specific. Make mistakes, make assumptions. Tell me what those assumptions are. But see if they have the energy and the open-mindedness to kind of put themselves in that place and run with it. You'll find out some of the most interesting things. I have in the past kind of stumbled on people who can do a broad set of things because I found out during the interview process that they had some appetite for doing videography. Would have never known, but it came out as part of the planning for a project that they didn't own yet, but we potentially really wanted them to. Ask about targeting and segmentation. So this is really, really key. So when the product marketing candidate talks about what they've done in the past, they'll tend to talk about what the product was or the feature that they were launching, what it looked like in terms of the relationship with the product organization or the sales organization, or with the customer if it's a direct SaaS self-serve product. And they'll talk about like where it went, like what were the things that they delivered in terms of adoption or revenue. But they won't necessarily talk about how they narrowed down the audience. And that's really key. Like no matter how great your product is, no matter how universally it can be used potentially, you still have to have the right message for the right audience in terms of being able to deliver that value. It won't be self-observable. Like you'll have to have some sense of like, okay, the person that can use this the most, the type of organization that can use this the most is X, and here is Y. And this represents a certain portion of the total market that we believe is big enough to get ROI from. So ask them, how do they figure out how to target effectively? How do they either do a cohort analysis or develop personas or do survey work or develop a hypothesis at least to say like, this is for a specific reason. Don't forget that who is the top of that inverted triangle. And then lastly, get a variety of work samples. So more and more I see early stage organizations skipping over this. They'll maybe do background checks, reference interviews, they'll maybe do back channeling, but they won't ask for past work. Regardless of what kind of role this person has had in the past, whether they've been a product marketer in the past or not, you still want to get a sense that like, A, do they write well? So blog posts, white papers, one-pagers, just see a couple of things to see like, do they actually convey an idea in a clear enough way? Even web pages, a lot of product marketers write the content for your website. Just can they get to the point quickly? And do they follow the sense of like, okay, why is this even important? If they're just describing the product, hey, a product manager can do that. An engineer can probably do that. But a product marketer has to understand like that it actually has some kind of value and it can convey that in writing. The other part is, do they influence? Are they able to be articulate in front of an audience? Whether that's an internal audience or an external audience. These are the people that if your organization grows quickly enough, they'll be speaking to not only customers, but they'll also be speaking on stage at conferences. They'll be trying to influence analysts to help you create a category. So they have to be able to convey things in a meaningful way based on who the audience are talking to. So if they have a video or they have decks that they've developed, have them present those. Just get a sense of like how they think through a narrative. And the last part of this, if you have a really good candidate who's more senior, think about finding out how they've operationalized things, like how they put processes in place. That's a little bit less important for early stage. So with that, thank you for having me.